What if everything they told you about burnout is dead wrong? This week, I'm inviting you into an honest reckoning. Every day, burnout headlines bombard us, whispering that our exhaustion is a personal flaw. But what if that's not true? What if the problem is deeper and our wisdom sees it all along? It's time to start challenging the burnout narrative. After all, whose interest is this burnout narrative serving? Spoiler alert, this narrative is not serving nurses, healers, and helping professionals. Let's unpack this together. Why are we so quick to accept that burnout and compassion fatigue are inevitable realities of our work? How do these news and social media stories frame the pain, the suffering, and the outright traumatization of our healers, nurses, and health professionals? Are they openly reporting the system and organizational failures that result in devastatingly avoidable traumatization? Or are they treating our pain as a self-care or knowledge deficit, a character flaw, or a resilience weakness? All of those are gaslighting narratives. Let's take a look under the surface together. I offer my gratitude to Dr. Karen Foley's middle range theory for nurse psychological trauma that underpins my work and this podcast episode. It makes things plain. So much of what we call burnout is, in truth, avoidable occupational or nurse-specific traumatization. You'll see that in our personal lives, we all have been affected by the various traumas that we have endured by virtue of being human. These are individual traumas, and they include acute traumas like car accidents, chronic traumas like being exposed to life-threatening mold in a house for 20 years. That's a page out of my life story. A complex trauma, which is any one or more of the types of trauma that we're talking about here. Developmental trauma, those would be your in utero, your ACEs, and your attachment traumas, anything that happens in early lifespan development, and neglect, physical, emotional. All of these are types of individual traumas that every human on the planet experiences. And then we go to work, and we are met with a host of avoidable and unavoidable trauma exposures. In the category of the unavoidable, we have vicarious or secondary trauma. We suffer along with those in our care, and we get some training and some tools as to how to navigate that. Similarly, trauma from disasters is unavoidable, and as nurses, we get training into how to manage and integrate those situations. Where we are being driven from the profession is the avoidable trauma exposures that have oftentimes have to do with system or organizational shortcomings. And those would include historical trauma. Two examples of historical trauma. Of course, the obvious is nurses eating their own. Nurses are unknowingly transmitting the oppressions and the abuses, the marginalization and the disenfranchisement that we have endured as a profession since the beginning. And then also we have the system that treats us like chattel or property. Our services are not considered healthcare provision services, but rather part of the room charge, like the bedside table or the urinal that's sitting on it. So we have historical trauma, we have workplace violence. This includes the physical violence that is skyrocketing, and also the bullying, the hazing, the workplace incivilities. All of that is workplace violence that is avoidable, as is system-induced trauma. And a classic example of this from nursing is if you have been battered in the line of duty, as I have, by a patient, and you go in literally bleeding, as I have, to your leader, your supervisor, following policy, and you have been traumatized, you have been assaulted, and you are making your report and seeking support, and the first question that's asked is, I know you all know this one, what could you have done differently to prevent it? That's system-induced trauma. Then we have insufficient resource trauma, also avoidable, and that's not having enough staff or having dangerous nurse-patient ratios, not having the equipment that we need or the resources that we need to deliver safe and effective care. And then the last category of avoidable nurse-specific traumatization is second victim trauma, and this is when a nurse has experienced a near miss or an adverse event or even a sentinel event. We carry the burden of the guilt and any shame that is around that event, and it's not always, in fact, it's usually not our burden to carry, because when we do a root cause analysis, the root cause is more often than not a system or organizational or procedure error, and not a nurse who was practicing unsafely. So those are the types of traumas that we all experience. And to the extent that we experience these, the American Association of Colleges of Nursing advises that nurses assume that every person in our care, or with whom we are colleagues, or with whom we encounter in the scope of our practice, we should assume that they have experienced trauma. Well, nurses, we are a subset of that everyone. We too carry the burden of unintegrated, unhealed trauma that we've endured over a lifetime, both personally and professionally. And then, we go to our professional roles, and we are met with an avalanche of occupational or nurse-specific trauma, most of which is avoidable and secondary to system or organizational failures. This is what's driving nurses from the profession in droves, in unprecedented numbers that have never been seen before. So let's start calling things by their true names. In my book, Nursing Our Healer's Heart, I made a promise to never sugarcoat the truth. I honor that promise through every word I write, every keynote address I deliver, and every podcast interview I participate in. So here is the unsweetened truth, my friends. There are many ways in which we are being avoidably traumatized in our professional roles. Let's call these traumas by their true names instead of the smoke and mirrors burnout myth. Traumatized to the extent that it is physiologically contraindicated to continue working in these harsh conditions. The harm is not just emotional. This trauma reaches every body system, even down to the cellular level, affecting our mitochondria's ability to produce energy. Stay tuned for an upcoming episode about what they're not teaching us in nursing school about the physiological and cellular level impact of nurse-specific trauma. In our professional roles, we are systematically exposed to a myriad of avoidable occupational traumas, such as historical trauma. Nurses, healers, and helping professionals inherit generational wounds from decades of subjugation, devaluation, and occupational sexism. This trauma is passed down through carbon and crystalline-based DNA, activated by epigenetic factors, which include unsafe or toxic workplaces. The historical trauma roots run deeper than most realize. As I mentioned, the fact that nurses are considered chattel or property is a startling reality. When hospitals account for our services as part of a room charge, we're no different than the trash can or the bedpan. Occupational oppression is systemic and deeply pervasive, and it's not okay. Workplace violence is running rampant, and it should never be tolerated anywhere. Being kicked, bitten, punched, scratched, having bodily excrements thrown at us, or being harassed is not part of the job. Contrary to the gaslighting perspectives in the mainstream media, we did not sign up for this. We did not sign up to be abused or traumatized. What we signed up for was to deliver safe, effective, and heart-centered nursing care. We did not sign up to be abused, assaulted, or traumatized. Another category that we can unpack a little further is the system-induced trauma. The piled-on masks, the moral injury, the unsafe staffing, impossible expectations. These are all leadership choices, not unfortunate accidents. Being asked, what could you have done differently after being physically assaulted in the line of duty is stratified traumatization. Trauma on top of trauma. So let's flip the script. Instead of answering that question, respond with, what could the organization have done to protect me? The other category that we're going to explore is insufficient resource trauma. Chronic shortages, nursing shortages, they're not a fluke. They're designed into the systems. No nurse should face trauma because of rationed staff expenditures masquerading as budget constraints. There's not a lack of funding for nurse wages. There's a lack of interest from the C-suite to appropriately allocate resources to safely deliver high-quality nursing care. We are not the problem. We are not replaceable furniture. We are not chattel. We are professionals deserving dignity and safety. When it comes to second victim traumas, there are mistakes that happen. And rather than do the root cause analysis and take organizational or procedural responsibility for that, the vast majority of leaders blame the nurse and shames them. And this shame grows where instead healing should be fostered. It's traumatic to have an adverse or a sentinel event, and we don't even get time to process or integrate that before the gaslighting and the blaming and the shaming begins. The vast majority of near misses, adverse events, and sentinel events, once the root cause analysis is completed, is attributed to system error or policy gaps. Yet we are blamed and shamed and written up and put on notice and required to do extra education modules and so much more. This is not a just culture. These second victim traumas are usually a subset of system-induced trauma. They are not a personal failure of any nurse in most instances. All too often, we are not supported in the processing and integration of the traumatic events that end up piling up, and we carry the burden of the blame and shame that was never ours to carry in the first place. The vast majority of the time, the blame and the shame should be ascribed to the system or the organization, not to the individual nurse. I have an example from the headline so we can set the record straight. We'll take a deep dive into an article that discusses the circumstances in Colorado where well-intentioned nurse leaders unknowingly regurgitated the outdated, non-trauma-informed burnout narrative instead of calling what is happening in Colorado what it is. It's nurse-specific traumatization unhinged. In a recent article published by Westwood titled Analysis, Colorado tops country in nurse burnout thanks to high patient count, little support. Here we find a classic example of the burnout myth being propagated by very well-intended nurse leaders. This is not a shortcoming of any of these leaders, for whom I hold the utmost of respect and compassion, but rather a reflection of the outdated and non-trauma informed burnout evidence base. Burnout is a symptom cluster of nurse-specific traumatization. It's a symptom, it's not the root cause. But I digress. Let's unpack how the burnout myth is keeping nurses stuck, trapped, sick, unsafe, hopeless, and professionally unwell in their roles. The avoidable nurse-specific traumatization veneered by the burnout narrative. This article from Westward reveals what is often cast as burnout among Colorado nurses is instead the direct result of repeated avoidable traumatic exposures built into their daily lives and perpetuated by systemic failures and outdated mindsets. The prevailing narrative frames nurse exhaustion as a personal shortcoming, but the reality is the presence of clear, preventable harms that leadership has failed to address. In this case study, right from the headlines, there are 3 forms of avoidable nurse-specific trauma. The outdated, non-trauma-informed burnout narrative is once again regurgitated when in fact we have these 3 classic examples. The first is workplace violence and bullying. Colorado nurses routinely face physical assault, sexual harassment, and verbal abuse, not just from patients and their families, but sometimes from their colleagues too. These incidents happen everywhere, not just emergency room departments, but also long-term care and outpatients clinics as well. Reporting such violence often leads not to support, but to insinuations that the nurse could have done something differently to avoid the trauma, intensifying feelings of isolation and blame. Systems for addressing and mitigating these assaults are largely ineffective, with nurses seldom given space or time to process what they've endured in these traumatic events. Instead, the focus is put back on the nurse to improve, as if the traumatic event was their fault. In other words, and again, we do not have a just culture, but rather one that gaslights and blames the victim. Classic case of nurse-specific traumatization. The article went on to state a second burnout veneer, saying that chronic understaffing leads to burnout, but it really leads to traumatic overwork. Colorado has one of the worst nurse-patient ratios in the country, 155 patients to 1 nurse. Chronic understaffing is an administrative decision and is highly preventable. Yet it directly results in nurses being unable to provide the standard of care they value, causing ongoing moral distress and emotional trauma. Nurses are routinely denied adequate breaks, pressured into overtime, and often assigned additional patients, even when training entry to practice nurses, thereby compounding the stress, increasing the workplace errors, and putting everyone at risk. Under these conditions, the trauma is the knowledge of being forced to do less than their best for their patients. This is not burnout. This is repeated avoidable trauma exposure imposed by the system itself. The third use case for burnout being touted as a root cause when in fact it's nurse-specific traumatization is the blame and retaliation that nurses endure when they do report problems. Many nurses in Colorado report fear of retaliation if they voice safety concerns or request supports after traumatic events. The threat of being reported to the Board of Nursing for raising legitimate problems or facing job loss if labeled as problematic creates a persistent environment of psychological threat. This dynamic is entirely avoidable, and it's the result of lack of confidential, supportive reporting pathways. It's yet another classic case of system-induced, avoidable nurse-specific traumatization, not burnout. So let's talk a little bit about how this burnout narrative is so gaslighting to so many nurses. By calling these repeated avoidable traumas burnout, organizations deny the real source of them, shifting the blame to nurses and failing to address the systemic policies and practices that perpetuate the trauma. This burnout narrative silences the call for systemic change. It discourages transparent reporting and strengthens a culture that expects nurses to push through, regardless of harm perpetuating trauma across generations. The so-called nurse burnout crisis in Colorado isn't about weak individuals. It's about the predictable result of avoidable workplace trauma. Chronic understaffing, routine exposure to workplace violence, and punitive responses to those who speak out are not mere stressors. They are traumatizing failures of leadership and policy. Until we recognize and remedy these systemic harms, blaming nurses as burned out will continue to gaslight and re-traumatize those who care for us all. I'd love to know what you are seeing, doing, or would like to see done about these important issues. Just drop a comment or jump over to my website at drlorrelaws.com and you can drop me a message there. If you or someone you know is struggling, there is support and a 4-step evidence-based pathway to preventing nurse-specific trauma's impact while making a full recovery from all that you've endured. This framework emerged from my 5 years of research spanning 4 academic disciplines. So if you're curious to learn more about how you're being misguided by the burnout myth and how you can heal nurse-specific trauma that is wreaking havoc in all dimensions of your life, please join my next free masterclass. You can enroll right on my website at drlorrelaws.com/masterclass and come right in, and I will unpack the science around the occupational and nurse-specific traumatization and present the 4-step evidence-based innate care plan framework that emerged from my research. You can start your healing journey that day. Healing is possible. You don't have to be traumatized in your role. You just need to learn the language of your autonomic nervous system and vagus nerve and learn how to navigate it so you can insulate yourself from the broken system. You can insulate yourself from dumpster fire work conditions so that you are regulated and thriving in your role, independent of the trauma exposures that you are experiencing each and every day. I am just so very grateful for your time and attention, and for your willingness and courage to look beyond the surface of the burnout myth and to honor the full depth of your lived experience. You are deeply seen, you are truly felt, and you are never alone on this journey towards healing. True healing is not a distant hope, it's real, it's tangible, and it's waiting for you. You no longer have to carry the heavy weight of the traumas that you've endured or the dis-eases that come alongside with the avoidable nurse-specific traumatization that you've endured. Together, we can begin to reclaim our nervous system, reconnect with ourselves and those around us, and step fully into the radiant beings that we are and that we love beneath the layers of trauma that have kept us shrunk and hidden for too long. This is a path of restoration, awakening, and reclaiming your wholeness. Thank you for walking it with me. From my healer's heart to yours, and until next time, please visit my website, drlorrelaws.com. Order my book, Nursing Our Healer's Heart, available anywhere. There's a free nurse trauma assessment on my website you can take to see how you are being affected, and you're welcome to come to my next masterclass. Hope to see you there. Namaste.